When a rogue experiment mutates animals into giant, destructive monsters, primatologist Davis Okoye teams up with a geneticist and a government agent to stop the chaos. As his gorilla friend George grows uncontrollable, they race to find a cure before Chicago is leveled by the monstrous rampage. In 1993, researchers discovered a groundbreaking technology called CRISPR, which enabled them to treat previously incurable diseases through genetic modification. However, in 2016, the U.S. government prohibited the use of CRISPR, citing its potential for misuse and labeling it a weapon of mass destruction. Now in the present day, the Athena 1 space station is completely devastated, with the entire crew dead, except for Carrie, who is desperately calling the control room for assistance. However, her supervisor refuses to unlock the door to the escape capsule unless Carrie retrieves the mutagen samples first. Terrified but determined to survive, Carrie navigates the wreckage and successfully secures the 3 samples, only to be discovered by the enemy. It turns out that a failed experiment has led to the creation of a monstrous, mutated rat that has gone berserk, and now it's hunting Carrie. She sprints through the crumbling station, dodging debris and flames, barely making it into the escape capsule before the creature can reach her. Carrie watches as the station erupts into a fiery explosion, but unfortunately, the rampaging rat has also damaged the capsule. Moments later, the capsule explodes, killing Carrie as its remains plummet toward Earth. Sometime later, at the San Diego Wildlife Sanctuary, primatologist Davis introduces his friend Nelson and 2 new employees to the gorilla habitat. The latest addition, Pavo, is particularly aggressive and is bothering the female gorillas, so Davis uses sign language to calm him down. At that moment, Davis's closest companion, George, appears, and Pavo immediately becomes agitated by the presence of another male. One of the employees panics and tries to flee, prompting Pavo to chase after him and knock him to the ground. However, before the situation escalates further, George intervenes and frightens Pavo away. Once everything settles, Davis and George exchange a series of playful jokes through sign language, and Davis reminds George that Pavo is now part of their family and must be protected as well. When Davis asks for a fist bump, George playfully flips him off first. Shortly after, one of the employees tries to ask Davis out, but he politely declines, prompting Nelson to tease him about preferring animals over people. Later that evening, the 3 mutagen canisters that Carrie recovered make their way to Earth. One crashes into the sanctuary, releasing its contents onto George. The second one lands deep in the forest, where a wolf stumbles upon it, while the third falls into a river and is swallowed by a crocodile. The next morning, Davis arrives at the sanctuary, only to be met with troubling news from Nelson. George has been acting strangely aggressive and has broken into the grizzly bear enclosure, where he ended up killing a bear. When Davis checks on George, he notices that the gorilla has also suffered injuries from the encounter. George appears remorseful and admits he made a mistake, but the most shocking revelation is that he has grown significantly larger overnight. Davis and his team investigate the area, and upon finding the canister, he decides to keep it for further research. Later, he analyzes George's blood work and is baffled. The results indicate a dangerously high level of growth hormone, one that should have been lethal. Nelson suggests that George should be put down, but Davis refuses, insisting they need to understand what's happening first. Meanwhile, siblings Brett and Claire are in the middle of an argument. Their company, Energene, is responsible for the development of the mutagen, and Brett is furious over the financial losses caused by the station's destruction. However, Claire is pleased with the outcome. The mutated rat proves that Project Rampage is a success. She remains optimistic about further progress, especially after receiving a report from the Meteor Society, revealing the location of one of the containers, which was designed to survive re-entry. Determined to retrieve it, she hires Burke and his private military unit to recover the sample. Burke's team makes their way to the forest and discovers that the canister has been breached and completely emptied. Even more disturbing, all the wolves in the area have been slaughtered. They quickly relay their findings to Claire. This makes her realize that the wolf is undergoing a mutation, so she orders Burke to track and capture the creature. Meanwhile, in the city, Kate watches the news and learns about both the Athena 1 disaster and George's attack on the bear. As a former Energene scientist, she quickly pieces things together and rushes to the sanctuary. There, she informs Davis that the canister he discovered contains a sample she personally created. Davis is skeptical, but Kate proves her expertise by listing every symptom George is experiencing. She insists that she's the only one who can help cure him. It turns out the mutagen is rewriting George's DNA by combining it with traits from other species, making him grow at an unnatural rate and increasing his aggression. Suddenly, George flies into a rage, violently constantly slamming against his cage until he finally breaks free. He then charges through the sanctuary, causing mass panic among the visitors, and even smashing cars with his fists. The police arrive and prepare to open fire, but Davis quickly steps in and calms George down using sign language. The officers lower their weapons, but a sniper in a helicopter fails to get the message and fires tranquilizer darts, taking George down. Meanwhile, in the forest, Burke and his team track down Ralph, the mutated wolf. They manage to hit him from their helicopter and assume he's down, so they land to search for the body. However, when they reach the ground, the body is nowhere to be found. Instead, they discover an enormous paw print, which unsettles some of the soldiers. Moments later, Ralph suddenly ambushes them and begins slaughtering the team one by one. The soldiers attempt to fight back with their weapons, and even the helicopter unleashes a barrage of machine gun fire. However, after being shot earlier, Ralph has developed an incredibly tough hide, and the bullets barely affect him. He has also grown to an enormous size, allowing him to leap astonishingly high and take down the helicopter with ease. On the ground, Burke is the only survivor. Desperate, he tries to fight back, but Ralph overpowers him effortlessly and devours him. That evening, Davis and Kate are taken into custody by FBI agent Russell, who accuses them of conducting illegal experiments on George. Meanwhile, George is being transported on a government plane along with them. When Davis gets a look at George in his cage, he realizes that his injuries are already healing at an unnatural rate. Russell then begins questioning them, mocking Davis for leaving the military to work with animals, and acting like a complete jerk by belittling both of them while ignoring their warnings about how dangerous it is to keep George confined on a plane. He also reveals that Kate was actually fired from Energene 2 years ago for attempting to steal company research, which led to her serving 13 months in prison. This revelation forces Kate to admit that she doesn't actually have a cure for George, which causes Davis to lose all trust in her. Meanwhile, back at Energene, Claire finds out that Kate has been arrested. Brett, worried that Kate is gathering evidence to expose their company, sees her as a serious threat. It's then revealed that Claire does in fact have a cure for the mutagen. With this in mind, she formulates a plan. She will lure all the mutated creatures to her building using low-frequency radio signals. Once they arrive, the military will be ready to eliminate them, allowing Claire to collect their DNA and sell it for profit. She isn't concerned about Kate's interference, because as far as she's concerned, George will eventually kill everyone on that plane anyway. When Claire activates the device, Ralph immediately stops his destruction on the roads and among the cars, instinctively turning toward the city. At the same time, Lizzie, the mutated crocodile, senses the signal as well and begins moving in the same direction. Meanwhile, on the plane, George is supposed to be fully sedated. However, Claire's trick causes him to wake up in a complete rage. He bursts out of his cage and begins tearing through everything in his path, throwing people around as if they weigh nothing. The guards open fire, but their bullets have no effect. When Russell tries to intervene, George swiftly knocks him to the ground, pinning him under his foot. Davis attempts to calm George down, but before he can, another soldier fires again, only provoking George even more. In the chaos, a stray bullet strikes a crate of explosives, triggering an explosion that takes out one of the plane's turbines. The aircraft begins to plummet. As George is flung against the wall by a rolling cart, Davis quickly secures parachutes for himself, Kate, and Russell. They manage to jump just in time before the plane crashes with George still inside. However, when they reach the crash site, they don't find his body. Instead, a clear trail in the grass suggests that George survived and is now also heading toward the city. At Energene, Claire is furious upon learning that Kate survived the plane crash. To make matters worse, the FBI arrives to seize all of the company's records and research. Desperate to save herself, Claire tries to shift the blame onto Kate, claiming she's responsible for everything the monsters have done. Meanwhile, Davis, exhausted by humanity's worst tendencies, tries to leave Kate behind. He's seen enough cruelty, especially during the war. He recalls how he found George as a baby, hiding under a car while watching his mother being slaughtered. However, he reconsiders after Kate finally explains her true motives. She developed CRISPR to cure her brother's fatal illness, but when the company sought to weaponize the mutagen, she tried to destroy it and was imprisoned for her efforts. Tragically, while she was behind bars, her brother passed away. Russell, now having warmed up to them after they saved his life, contacts his team for extraction. The group is soon taken to an Air Force base, where Colonel Blake presents them with footage of George and Ralph charging toward the city. Davis points out that it's impossible for a gorilla and a wolf to travel in a perfectly straight line toward the same destination. Kate realizes they must be responding to a signal, meaning Claire is likely waiting with an antidote. Russell supports their theory, but Blake refuses to involve civilians and orders them to be escorted away. Outside, Davis tries negotiating with the soldiers to let them go, but when that fails, he resorts to force, swiftly knocking both guards unconscious. He and Kate then attempt to steal a helicopter, and when Russell catches them in the act, instead of stopping them, he tosses them the keys and a phone to stay in touch. Meanwhile, Blake's military forces launch a full-scale attack on the monsters. However, even their most powerful weapons, including massive explosions, prove useless. The entire army is decimated. Seeing no other option, Blake orders an immediate evacuation of the city before the creatures arrive. Russell relays this information to Davis, who doubts they'll be able to get everyone out in time. When George and Ralph finally reach the city, destruction begins instantly. Buildings collapse, cars are obliterated, and any helicopter that dares to approach is swatted out of the sky. The military responds with tanks and heavy artillery, but nothing even slows the monsters down. They continue rampaging through everything in sight. Before long, Lizzie emerges from the river, joining the other beasts in their path of devastation. Using its massive jaws, the mutated crocodile crushes tanks and jets that cross its path, worsening the chaos. Desperate for a solution, Blake orders his men to prepare a bomb that will wipe out half the city. Russell tries to stop him, explaining that Davis and Kate are en route to retrieve the antidote. But Blake, still furious over the stolen helicopter, refuses to listen and dismisses Russell from the operation. At that moment, Russell receives the results of the evidence collected from Energene. Realizing he now has what he needs to take action, he calls for a transport so he can proceed with arrests. Meanwhile, as the jet carrying the bomb takes off, Davis and Kate successfully infiltrate Energene and steal 3 vials of the antidote. However, Claire spots them through the security cameras and rushes to stop them, explaining that the antidote will only eliminate aggression but won't revert the creature's massive size. She then snatches the vials from Kate and shoots Davis, causing him to collapse unconscious. Claire takes Kate hostage and drags her to the rooftop, planning to escape via helicopter. But before they can take off, George climbs to the top of the building and smashes the helicopter's tail, sending it spinning out of control. The chaos nearly sends Kate plummeting to her death, but at that moment, Davis, who has regained consciousness, grabs her just in time, revealing that the bullet missed any vital organs. While George proceeds to destroy the antenna, broadcasting the signal, Kate reveals that she managed to hide one of the vials, meaning they still have a chance to save George. Claire attempts to take them on again, but Kate uses the moment to slip the antidote into Claire's bag before knocking her out with a punch. Davis then signals George, who picks up Claire and swallows her whole, unknowingly ingesting the antidote in the process. Meanwhile, Brett attempts to flee down the stairwell, clutching the last remaining computer and a lab rat in hopes of starting over elsewhere. However, when he reaches the ground floor, he runs straight into Russell. The agent confiscates Brett's stolen items in exchange for letting him walk free. But before Brett can celebrate his escape, he steps outside, only to be instantly crushed by falling debris. Outside, Lizzie and Ralph continue tearing through the city as George, now under the antidote's influence, begins to calm down. Davis and Kate use the damaged helicopter to escape right before the building collapses entirely. Though the helicopter crashes on the ground, the duo miraculously survives. Davis then realizes that there are still civilians nearby and that George is back to his senses. With Ralph and Lizzie now battling each other, he tells Kate to find Russell while he arms himself and joins George in the fight. The monsters clash violently, but in the end, Lizzie overpowers Ralph and kills him by crushing his neck in her powerful jaws. Now only Lizzie and George remain. Though George fights fiercely, he struggles to gain the upper hand. Hoping to help, Davis throws a belt of grenades onto Lizzie's back. Unfortunately, Lizzie has become so powerful that the explosions barely faze her. She quickly recovers and slams George into a building, impaling him through the chest with a steel beam. Lizzie then turns her attention toward Davis, who frantically scavenges weapons from the wrecked helicopter to keep her distracted. The massive crocodile takes the bait and starts charging at him, nearly killing him in the process. But just as she's about to strike, George summons his remaining strength, yanks the steel bar from his chest, and leaps into the air, driving it straight through Lizzie's eye, finally putting an end to the battle. Meanwhile, Kate reaches Russell and informs him that George received the antidote. Russell immediately contacts Blake to call off the airstrike. Watching the destruction unfold on his screens, Blake sees the battle's outcome and realizes George is now an ally, ultimately aborting the mission. Unfortunately, after securing victory, George collapses. Davis kneels beside him, mourning the loss loss of his best friend. But just as he's about to walk away, he notices a slight movement. George is still alive. The gorilla, ever the prankster, flips Davis off before offering him a fist bump. With the city saved and George back to normal, Davis now faces his next mission, finding a new home for his giant friend.